Welcome everyone for this exclusive interview with Wolfgang Fengler, the lead economist for Europe and Central Asia for the World Bank. Wolfgang, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Kevin. Happy to be here.
With so many voices and opinions and innovation and ideas here, what brings you to the Global Summit?
Well, the Global Summit, I guess, is the best moment and the best combination of people that work on technology, on data, on economics, creative minds, and to think about the future. So I think there's no better place to think and talk about the future and to be with like-minded people who want to make the world a better place.
You spoke about global tipping points. What do you mean by that? What did you talk about?
I did talk about income and demographics, which is basically that if you just focus your life on two big questions, you may have these questions: is how long do I live, how much money do I earn? And so that's what I've developed with friends and colleagues, data machines that help you predict and map these big trends. And so if you break that down, actually it's quite interesting because it will not only happen once in our lifetime, which is now, that half the world, in a broad definition, is middle class or wealthy, and half the world is poor. Unfortunately, that half is getting less and less, but still, tipping point. Half the world, 3.8 billion people, are still poor by our definition, or very poor by the World Bank's definition. Half the world is now middle class or wealthier. But also, if you have kids and you think of what is actually old or young for them, and for a broader perspective on population, you can actually see that half the world is now 30 years or younger. These are the young crowd, and then the other half is older. And so that's the double tipping point. Half the world young and poor, young and old, the other half poor and rich. That's basically the only time that we can experience that.
That's interesting. And so what's it been like in the past, and why is this such an important issue now?
Well, as has been often referred to and explained here in Singularity, the world, fortunately, for a long time has becoming better. Not all the time everywhere, but on balance it's become better. And so that means people live longer, people die later. And so in the old days, half the world was only about children, and now half the world are children plus young adults. So that's already the improvement, and it will move towards what are older people, because people live longer, and when they live till 100, and then if I live till 100, obviously we bring the average quite up a bit, because we balance somebody else just been born, so the average would be 50 for you and me in this scenario. And for income, it's the same. As people live longer, if they have better skills, as their economic potential develops, people have more income. And especially we see this in Asia now, where half actually of the affluent in the world are Asians. And that's basically what you could call the economic revolution happened in Asia over the last 30 years to come through now. But it needs that momentum over time. It's not just one thing happens and suddenly everybody becomes rich. China, India, and all these countries have had reforms and have had this economic momentum now for decades.
We were speaking beforehand about the World Bank's focus on poverty. What type of, obviously economics, the study of incentives, what incentives have you been studying focused primarily on poverty right now?
Well, indeed, World Bank's main aim is to end poverty and to help also the world community end poverty by 2030. And the world is making progress, but not fast enough. And some countries are falling behind. I myself lived in Africa, and Africa has many countries which are falling behind. Some countries are doing fine, so there's quite some balance there. And so, in the end, there have been a number of obviously bad policies, including fuel subsidies, which are good for the rich and those who have a car, but bad for the budget, bad for the environment, and ultimately bad for the poor, because they don't get then the social services that the budget could spend anyway. So there's a lot of, I think, successful and reforms and projects and learning, and that have to do with social protection, from Brazil to Indonesia to other parts of Asia, to great innovations like mobile money, where actually when I was in Kenya was the world market leader and still has been the biggest, at that time, biggest platform of mobile money, which actually is not just about transferring funds, often from urban to rural and from wealthier parts of the family to poorer, but also to pay for services like electricity, not queuing up at the utility station for half a day to pay and then possibly have to corrupt somebody. So those are some of the breakthroughs, I think, that have changed people's lives over the decade, and that are somehow the impetus for the next decade.
So when I just asked you about incentives, and you recommended some policies and some things that have worked. What's an example, say, with like Singapore or any countries that stick out to you that have been successful and that you would recommend for other countries to take initiative?
Yeah. So you mean incentive specific, like just general policies?
I would say
of
financial incentives.
Well, again, Singapore is a poster child of obviously developing from third country, third world to first world. But Singapore is not the only successful country. Korea, Botswana, Oman, other countries have had successes, at least for a certain long period of time. And incentives are part of it, but actually the bigger issue was more policy, to say, and including education policy. So rule of law, macroeconomic stability, openness to trade, openness to business, a credible legal system. These are much more important. The debate on incentive is around industrial policy. Should you target certain industries? And that's a debate I think that's too broadly unresolved. There's some successful examples where government focus and even incentive have helped, but there's enough white elephants or other type of stranded assets where it would have been better if the market would just have decided, a bit like in Silicon Valley, where many things get created, but also many things get have to be recreated, and you have to get rid of something. And once you have the strong government incentive package, and often it's more difficult.
I took a recent visit to Indonesia, and I had a great opportunity to stay with a family of 30 in rural Bali, right? And these people are super poor, but just the happiest people. What are some of the discussions you have with leaders about raising people out of poverty, and maybe what are some of the pros and cons to this?
Yeah, well, obviously how somebody can become happy, that's on the one hand an individual decision and question, and it should not be prescribed. In general, I think though people can agree that living longer and having more money, 99.9% of the world want to have that. And then on balance, I think, at least that's the research I looked at, actually wealthier people are happier, but if you're normally wealthy, you're as happy as the super wealthy. So then at a certain limit, you don't become happier. And then there's obviously a lot of individual life stories that go with this. But typically poorer families go through a lot of drama, a lot of constraint, a lot of short-term stress of how to, make sure the next meal comes. Again, Bali is not the poorest part of the world or Indonesia, but it's not the richest either, it's somewhere in between. And so maybe this family already is better off than their parents' generation.
Yes.
And their kids are in school or are in more years in school, or the girls are in school. All of this has happened, and that will help, not just for happiness, but also for future income and then longer, healthier lives.
How do different cultures play a role in this progression? Because I know, like this family in Bali, I'll stick with this example. They're named in a poor income class or social class, so they're only named 4 different names to be like the farmers. And if you're a middle class worker, you're named 4 different names. And if you're a judge or official or a cardinal, you're named something else. So how does those systemic barriers, work with your economic policies?
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting question, and something that probably needs more deeper understanding, because there is clearly an understanding that this is constraining development as we understand it, and but there is counter trends. So you have obviously in India is the other example of a caste system where people and children get categorized based on something they have had no say and had no role in. But then with urbanization and modernization, the caste system also starts to get diluted, a bit like I guess in the Middle Ages it was in our home countries, where we had also a type of caste system, and then only were the rulers and the farmers and a few in between. And now that also is opening up, and so there is it's clearly a factor, and there is some interesting recent work if you think of life expectancy and some of the key variables that hinder it. One thing in the US quite often discussed now, suicide. It's actually going down a lot in India, and again a caste-based system. And it's not just a caste issue, but also a cultural issue, the role of women and the empowerment in early marriage. And many women actually committed early suicide because life was actually quite horrible in part of rural India, and that number is actually going down now. That number is going down. That's a positive trend, partly because of urbanization, education, and women are actually more empowered to then overcome these cultural barriers that you mentioned.
Wolfgang, you study this for a living. What excites you about this, and where do you see the future of the economy going in years to come?
Well, it excites me, basically my generation, but also your generation, that we can live a global life and we can have a better understanding of the world that we have never had before. Obviously, there were a lot of papers written and a lot of experiences and travels that we had to done our parents, but we can do it in a new way, right? You travel to Indonesia quite easily. I was just in Kenya last week. It's much easier to do that and to engage with people. Obviously, new technologies help there. So you have a much different understanding of how things are. Still imperfect. And then I'm just have this passion that we talked about before to really understand things better and have the numbers line up with what we're interested in and what is relevant. And so often the numbers, actually including from the World Bank, are a bit outdated, a few years old. And my passion is to translate this number into something what's happening today. And even if it's still as a margin of error, it's much more relevant and helpful to say, okay, that's the number of poor Kenyans today, and then that's the number of poor girls in Bali today. And if you know that, then you can have the right interventions to help there. And that's, I think there's a frontier that's yet to happen, and that's why I'm coming back to your early question, why I'm here, because technology space is very fascinating, but very few technologists know economics. And the economic space is also very exciting, but very few economists know about technology. And the intersection, that's my sweet spot, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm excited to be with you.
Well, let's talk about technology. What does a world economist for the World Bank think about blockchain and cryptocurrency?
Personally, well, I know the jury's out. I see enormous potential, right? It's like the trust machine, as some call it, that you can have a given trend. Obviously, the world is becoming wealthier, people have more money, but still not enough, and I want to buy stuff cheaply and securely. And still for many, especially the poor or those who migrated and then send money back home, it's very costly. And to find ways to make this easier is clearly some space for major opportunity. The same goes for supply chains. If you think many countries actually want to export food stuff, and the poorer countries have a comparative advantage, and there's lots of nice produce and nice fruits, but if you don't have the quality control or the certainty where things come from, it's a problem, and our blockchain can help solve this. Now there's flip sides, I know. There's a question of dark money and other type of structures, but it's like with any innovation, right? The knife killed many people, and the car as well, but still it was a good invention, so you need to mitigate the risks that come with that.
Interesting. I'm fascinated to learn more about it. I'm excited about this issue. And so, we spoke a lot today about raising poverty. We spoke a lot about circumstances and how financial incentives, whether it's policy, whether it's just the culture, systemic, will make these changes and these progressions in the future. And lastly, this is going to take a lot of leadership. It's going to take a lot of discussions. What would you say your definition of a real leader is?
Real leader, wow. Obviously there's a lot of inspirations, and some have mentioned them, right? But I guess the leader is somebody who is able to absorb some of those big trends and some of those inconsistencies with that, and then chart a way that's not short-term but as long-term. There's a perspective at least of 10 years. And then there's the broader leadership traits that we all talk about and that we have inspirations on in the US, obviously often cherished Al-Mulali, who turned a company around, actually not being the ultimate expert on it, but having a leadership and an emotional intelligence structure in place that brings the best out of other people. And that's, I think, ultimately what good leadership is about. You bring the best out of others.
I respect it. I love it. Wolfgang, thank you so much
for your time. Thank you so much, Kevin. It was great.
Global tipping points, incentives, structure and leadership lessons, all in 15 minutes. You're listening to Wolfgang Fengler, the lead economist for Europe and Central Asia for the World Bank. Wolfgang, thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it.